I grew up believing the farm was sold to pay debts, but the barn held a letter that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Before you explore this story, hit subscribe while you're here. Tomorrow, I'm dropping a special story that's going to leave you speechless. I was 3 days away from my 18th birthday when Mrs. Chen from County Social Services called me into her office at Riverside Group Home. I'd been living there since I was 7, ever since my parents died, and I entered the system with nothing but a backpack and a faded photograph of a farm I barely remembered. The photo showed a white farmhouse with green shutters, a red barn, and endless fields stretching toward a tree line. My mother had kept it on our refrigerator, though she never talked much about where she came from or why she'd left. Mrs. Chen had this careful expression on her face, the one social workers get when they're about to deliver news they can't predict your reaction to. She slid a manila envelope across her desk, my name written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. "This came from a law office in Nebraska," she said. "It's regarding your mother's family estate." I stared at the envelope like it might explode. My mother's family. In 11 years, nobody had ever mentioned my mother having family. The intake paperwork when I entered foster care listed no known relatives. I'd assumed I was alone in the world, that whatever family existed had either died or wanted nothing to do with me. Inside the envelope was a letter from an attorney named Margaret Foster. The words blurred together as I tried to process what I was reading. "Your maternal grandfather, William Hartford, passed away 6 months ago. As his sole surviving heir, you are entitled to his property and estate. However, there are complications regarding the family farm that require your immediate attention." My grandfather. I had a grandfather, and he'd been alive all these years while I rotated through foster homes and group facilities. The betrayal hit me before the grief could even register. The letter went on to explain that the farm, 160 acres in rural Nebraska, had been left to me in William's will. But my uncle, my mother's brother Thomas, had moved onto the property, claiming that William had promised it to him verbally before he died. Thomas was contesting the will and refusing to leave. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. The farm from the photograph, the place my mother had come from, was real. It existed, and it was supposed to be mine, except some uncle I'd never heard of was trying to steal it. Why didn't anyone tell me I had family? I asked Mrs. Chen, my voice cracking. Why didn't my grandfather ever contact me? She looked genuinely troubled. "According to the attorney's letter, your grandfather tried to gain custody when you first entered the system, but he was in his 70s with health problems, living alone on a failing farm. The state determined he couldn't provide adequate care. The attorney says he never stopped trying, though. He sent letters to the state asking about you, but the communication broke down somewhere in the bureaucracy. So he'd wanted me. He'd tried. And I'd spent 11 years thinking nobody cared, when the whole time there was someone out there who'd been asking about me, thinking about me, planning to leave me everything he had. The attorney wants you to call her," Mrs. Chen continued. "Apparently, time is critical. Your uncle is selling off equipment and livestock, claiming he needs to keep the operation running, but the attorney suspects he's liquidating assets before the will can be properly executed." I called Margaret Foster that afternoon from the group home's office, my heart hammering. She had a kind but businesslike voice, the tone of someone who dealt with complicated family situations regularly. Your grandfather spoke about you often, she told me. He kept that photograph of your mother at the farm, the same one you probably have. He was devastated when she died and heartbroken that he couldn't bring you home. But he made sure you'd inherit everything when you turned 18. What about my Uncle Thomas? I asked. Can he really take the farm? She sighed. That's where things get complicated. Your grandfather's will is clear and legal. The farm goes to you. But Thomas has been living there for the past 15 years, supposedly helping William run the operation. He claims your grandfather promised him the property in exchange for his caretaking, and he's filed a lawsuit contesting the will based on verbal agreements and undue influence. Can he win? Not if we can prove the will reflects your grandfather's true intentions, Margaret said, but we need to act fast. Thomas has already sold 2 tractors, a significant portion of the livestock, and he's negotiating with a developer about selling the timber rights to the eastern 40 acres. Every day he remains on the property, he's diminishing your inheritance. What do I do? Come to Nebraska, she said simply. I can fight this from my office, but it would be much stronger if you were here, present, showing the court that you're serious about claiming your inheritance. We have a hearing scheduled in 3 weeks to determine temporary possession of the property. If you're there, willing to take responsibility for the farm, it strengthens our case considerably. I had $63 in my bank account and no way to get to Nebraska. But Mrs. Chen, who'd always been more advocate than bureaucrat, helped me figure it out. She contacted a charity that helped foster kids transition to independence, and they provided a bus ticket and $200 for basic expenses. 3 days after my 18th birthday, I stepped off a Greyhound in Hartley, Nebraska, population 2,300. The town was exactly what I'd imagined when I looked at that photograph. Brick buildings along Main Street, a grain elevator visible against the horizon, pickup trucks parked at angles in front of a diner called Rosie's. Margaret Foster met me at the bus station, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that assessed me quickly. You look like your mother, she said. Same stubborn chin. You're going to need that stubbornness in the next few weeks. She drove me to her office and spread out documents across a conference table. These are the property records, tax documents, and your grandfather's will. Everything is straightforward legally. William Hartford owned 160 acres free and clear, left it entirely to you, with the exception of $10,000 to be donated to the local Veterans Association. Thomas isn't mentioned in the will at all. Why not? I asked. If Thomas was taking care of him, why wouldn't grandfather leave him something? Because Thomas wasn't taking care of him, Margaret said bluntly. He was taking advantage of him. Your grandfather was sharp-minded until the end, and he knew exactly what Thomas was doing. That's why he made sure the will was ironclad, and why he contacted me 6 months before he died to make sure everything was in order. She showed me photographs of the farm taken 2 weeks earlier. The white farmhouse looked run down, paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. The barn's roof was sagging in places. Rusted equipment sat in overgrown fields. This wasn't the pastoral scene from my childhood photograph. This was neglect and decay. Thomas let it fall apart, Margaret explained. Your grandfather had a stroke 3 years ago that left him partially disabled. He needed help, and Thomas moved in supposedly to provide it. But what he actually did was isolate William, run off anyone who tried to visit, and slowly drain the farm's resources while doing minimal maintenance. Anger burned in my chest. My grandfather had needed help, had needed family, and this man had exploited him instead of caring for him. "I want to see the farm," I said. Margaret hesitated. "Thomas is there. He knows about you and about the will. He's not going to be welcoming." "I don't care," I said. "It's my property. I want to see it." We drove out of town, following a 2-lane highway that cut through fields of winter wheat and pasture land. After about 15 minutes, Margaret turned onto a gravel road marked by a weathered wooden sign, Hartford Farm. My heart clenched as we approached. Despite its condition, I recognized every detail from the photograph. The curve of the driveway, the placement of the barn, the old oak tree beside the house. This was the place my mother had grown up, the place she'd left behind for reasons I'd never fully understood. A man came out of the house as we pulled up, and I knew immediately it was Thomas. He was in his early 50s, tall and heavy-set, with thinning brown hair, and a face that might have been handsome once, but was now hardened by bitterness and too much sun. "What's she doing here?" he demanded, not even looking at me directly. "This is your niece," Margaret said calmly. "She has every right to see the property she's inheriting." "She's not inheriting anything," Thomas shot back. "This farm is mine. I've worked it for 15 years while she was God knows where, doing God knows what. Dad promised me this place. Just because he got confused at the end and wrote some stupid will doesn't change what we agreed to." "William wasn't confused," Margaret said. "He was completely competent when he executed that will, and we have medical documentation to prove it." I stepped forward, finding my voice. "I'm Samantha," I said. "Your niece. My mother was your sister." Thomas finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't curiosity or even hatred. It was dismissal, like I was something insignificant that had wandered into his territory by mistake. "I don't know you," he said, "and I don't owe you anything. Your mother left this place 30 years ago and never looked back. She made her choice. This farm is mine now, and you can tell your lawyer that I'm not going anywhere." "We'll see what the court says," Margaret replied. "In the meantime, you're not to sell any more equipment or livestock. The court has issued a temporary restraining order preventing you from liquidating assets." Thomas's face darkened. "You can't stop me from running my own farm." "It's not your farm," I said quietly. "It's mine. My grandfather left it to me, and you know it." For a moment, I thought he might actually become violent. His hands clenched into fists, and his jaw worked like he was chewing on words too angry to release. But Margaret stepped between us, her voice firm. "We're leaving now. You'll be served with official court documents by the end of the week. I suggest you hire an attorney if you haven't already." As we drove away, I looked back at the farm through the rear window. Thomas stood in the driveway watching us go, and I could feel the hatred radiating from him even at a distance. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. That night, Margaret put me up in a small apartment above her office that she sometimes used for out-of-town clients. It was basic but clean, and, more importantly, it was free. I lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about my grandfather. a man I couldn't remember who'd spent his last years being exploited by his own son, waiting for a granddaughter he'd never gotten to know. The next morning, I went back to the farm. Margaret had advised against it, but I needed to understand what I was fighting for. I parked down the road and walked onto the property, cutting through the fields rather than approaching the house directly. The land was beautiful, even in its neglected state. Rolling fields with good soil, a creek running through the eastern section, stands of hardwood trees that had probably been there for generations. I could see why my grandfather had fought to keep it, why he'd wanted me to have it. I made my way to the barn, a massive structure that had clearly been the heart of the operation at one time. The doors were partially open, and I slipped inside, breathing in the smell of old hay and machine oil. Equipment sat covered in dust, some of it probably valuable if it still worked. Stalls lined one wall, empty now except for cobwebs and scattered straw. At the back of the barn, I found a small room that had been set up as an office. Inside was a desk buried under papers, filing cabinets with drawers hanging open, and on the wall a bulletin board covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. My breath caught. There, among the pictures of prize cattle and harvest celebrations, were photographs of me. School pictures from every year I'd been in the system, starting when I was 7. Someone had been sending them to my grandfather. Someone had made sure he knew what I looked like as I grew up, even though we'd never met. Tears blurred my vision as I realized he'd been watching over me from a distance, collecting proof that I existed, that I was real. Next to the photographs was a map of the farm with sections labeled, in shaky handwriting, Samantha's Inheritance. Different areas were marked with notes about soil quality, water rights, and timber value. He'd been planning for me, organizing everything so I'd know what I had. "What the hell are you doing here?" I spun around. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. "I told you to stay away," he said, advancing into the room. "This is private property." "It's my property," I said, standing my ground despite my pounding heart. "And these are photographs of me. My grandfather was thinking about me, planning for me." Thomas glanced at the bulletin board, and something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, but close. He covered it quickly with more anger. "Those pictures don't mean anything," he said. Old man was senile, living in the past. He didn't know what he was doing when he made that will. "The medical records say otherwise," I replied. He was competent. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left everything to me. "You think you can just walk in here and take over?" Thomas laughed harshly. "You don't know the first thing about farming. You're some city kid who's going to run this place into the ground within a year. I've spent 15 years keeping this operation alive, and you want to take it away from me because of a piece of paper?" "You didn't keep it alive," I said, anger giving me courage. "You let it fall apart while you sold off everything valuable. My grandfather needed help, and you abandoned him while living off his property." Thomas's face went dark red. "You don't know what you're talking about. I took care of him when nobody else would. Where were you when he was dying?" "Oh, right. You were in some group home feeling sorry for yourself." The words hit like a physical blow, but I refused to back down. I was in the system because I had no family, because nobody told me he existed, but he knew about me. He wanted me here, and you made sure that never happened because you wanted this farm for yourself. For a moment, we stood facing each other in that dusty office, surrounded by evidence of my grandfather's love and Thomas's betrayal. Then Thomas's expression shifted, becoming calculating. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll make you a deal. Sign over your rights to the farm, and I'll give you $50,000. That's more money than you've ever seen. You can go back to wherever you came from, start a new life, and I'll take care of this place the way it deserves. 50,000 for 160 acres of prime farmland." I almost laughed. "You really think I'm that stupid?" "Think about it," Thomas pressed. "You're 18 years old with no skills, no money, no idea how to run a farm. Even if you win in court, you'll lose the property within a few years because you can't manage it. Take the money, walk away, and everyone wins." I looked at the photographs on the wall, at my school pictures arranged chronologically, at the map labeled with my name. My grandfather had believed in me enough to leave me everything he'd built. He'd trusted that I would figure it out, that I would be worthy of his legacy. "No," I said firmly, "I'm not signing anything. This farm is mine, and I'm keeping it." Thomas's jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake. That's my decision to make." I walked past him and out of the barn, my legs shaking, but my resolve solid. Behind me, I heard him slam something against the wall, but I didn't look back. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned everything I could about farming and about my family's history. Margaret connected me with neighbors who'd known my grandfather, and they filled in details about the man who'd left me his legacy. William Hartford had been a fair and honest farmer, respected in the community for his integrity and his skill with livestock. He'd married late in life, and his wife had died young, leaving him to raise 2 children alone. My mother, Sarah, had been his favorite, smart and artistic, dreaming of a life beyond the farm. Thomas had been troubled from childhood, resentful of responsibility, and always looking for the easy way out. When Sarah left for college and never came back, it broke William's heart. She'd married my father against William's wishes, moved to the city, and cut off contact. Years later, when my parents died in a car accident, William had tried desperately to get custody of me, but the state deemed him too old and infirm. He never forgave himself for losing both his daughter and his granddaughter. An elderly farmer named Jack Morrison told me over coffee at Rosie's Diner. But he never stopped hoping you'd come back someday. That's why he held on to the farm even when it would have been easier to sell. He wanted you to have something from your family, something that connected you to where you came from. The more I learned, the more determined I became to fight for the farm. This wasn't just about property or inheritance. It was about honoring the grandfather who'd never stopped thinking about me, about reclaiming the family history that had been stolen by foster care bureaucracy and Thomas's greed. The court hearing arrived on a cold February morning. Margaret and I sat at one table, Thomas and his attorney at another. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Helen Morrison, Jack's sister as it turned out, reviewed the documents with careful attention. Thomas's attorney argued that his client had been promised the farm verbally, that he'd devoted 15 years of his life to maintaining the operation, and that William Hartford had been unduly influenced when he made his will. Margaret countered with medical records showing William's mental competence, financial records proving Thomas had been selling assets and pocketing profits, and testimony from neighbors about Thomas's neglect of both the property and his father. Then it was my turn to speak. I stood up, my voice shaking but clear, and told my story. I told the judge about growing up in foster care, about the photograph of the farm I'd carried with me through every placement, about discovering I had a grandfather who'd wanted me but couldn't have me. I explained how I'd found the photographs in the barn, proof that William Hartford had been watching over me from a distance, planning for the day I'd be old enough to claim my inheritance. I talked about my determination to learn farming, to honor his legacy, and to build a life on the land he'd preserved for me. When I finished, there were tears in several people's eyes, including Judge Morrison's. She looked at Thomas with an expression that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Hartford," she said, "do you have anything to say for yourself? Any explanation for why you've been liquidating assets from a property you don't legally own?" Thomas stood, and for a moment I thought he might actually be honest. Instead, he doubled down. "That farm is mine," he said. "I earned it through years of hard work. My father promised it to me, and some last-minute will doesn't change that. This girl is a stranger who knows nothing about farming or family. She has no right to take what I've built." "You've built nothing," Judge Morrison said sharply. "You've dismantled what your father spent his lifetime creating. The medical evidence clearly shows William Hartford was of sound mind when he executed his will. The financial records show you've been systematically stealing from the estate. And the testimony of multiple witnesses paints a picture of neglect and exploitation." She looked down at the documents before her, then back up at Thomas. "I'm granting temporary possession of the property to Samantha Hartford, effective immediately. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings from the premises. If you fail to comply, the sheriff will assist with your removal. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full accounting of all assets sold from the estate in the past 6 months. You will be required to reimburse the estate for anything sold below fair market value." The gavel came down, and just like that, the farm was mine. Thomas exploded, shouting about injustice and corruption, but the bailiff escorted him out before he could cause a real scene. Margaret squeezed my hand, tears streaming down her face. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said. 3 days later, I moved into the farmhouse. Thomas had cleared out, taking more than his personal belongings, I discovered. He'd stripped the house of anything valuable, including antique furniture that had been in the family for generations. But he'd left the photograph bulletin board in the barn either because he forgot about it or because even he couldn't bring himself to destroy evidence of my grandfather's love. The house felt empty and sad, without furniture, but it was mine. I walked through every room, imagining my mother growing up here, my grandfather sitting on the porch watching the sunset. In the master bedroom, I found something Thomas had missed: a loose floorboard that lifted easily, revealing a metal box underneath. Inside was a letter addressed to me in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, along with a small leather journal. "Dear Samantha," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've claimed your inheritance, and I'm at peace knowing the farm is in good hands. I want you to understand why I left everything to you instead of to Thomas. Your uncle is my son, and I love him despite his faults. But he never loved this land the way your mother did, the way I hope you will. He saw it as something to exploit, to extract value from, without giving anything back. Your mother understood that farming isn't just about profit. It's about stewardship, about caring for something larger than yourself and passing it on better than you found it. She left because she wanted a different life, and I respected that even though it broke my heart. But she taught you to love beauty and hard work. I could see it in those school pictures they sent me every year. The journal contains everything I know about this farm: where the water runs best, which fields are most productive, how to read the weather and the seasons. Learn from it, make mistakes, but most importantly, make this place your own. Build a life here that honors your mother's memory and my hopes for you. You come from farmers and dreamers, from people who believed in working hard and loving deeply. That's in your blood. Don't let anyone, especially Thomas, make you doubt that you belong here. With all my love, your grandfather, William. I sat on the floor of that empty bedroom and cried, mourning the grandfather I'd never known and celebrating the gift he'd given me. The farm wasn't just land, it was belonging. It was proof that I came from somewhere and someone, that I had roots deeper than any foster placement could provide. The next morning, I started reading the journal, page after page of detailed notes about soil composition, crop rotation, livestock management, and weather patterns. My grandfather had essentially written me a manual for running the farm, anticipating every question I might have. I also reached out to Jack Morrison and the other neighbors who testified at the hearing. They welcomed me into their community, offering advice, loaning equipment, and teaching me the practical skills I'd need to survive my first year. It wasn't easy. I made countless mistakes, learned through failure more often than success, and there were nights I fell into bed so exhausted I couldn't even think. But slowly, week by week, I began to understand what my grandfather had meant about stewardship. The land responded to attention and care. Fields that had been neglected began producing again. The barn became functional with repairs. I bought a small herd of cattle using the money from the court-ordered reimbursement Thomas had to pay, and I learned how to care for them through trial and error and endless patience from my neighbors. I also enrolled in online courses through the university's agricultural extension program, learning the science behind what my grandfather had understood instinctively. Knowledge became confidence, and confidence became competence. 6 months after claiming my inheritance, I stood on the porch of the farmhouse at sunset, watching light paint the fields gold and orange. The house had furniture now, mostly second-hand, but comfortable. The barn was organized and productive. The fields showed the green shoots of a successful planting. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photograph I'd carried for 11 years, the one of the farm in its prime. Then I took a new picture from the same angle, capturing the farm as it looked now, not perfect yet, but healing, coming back to life under my care. This was home, not because I'd been born here, but because I'd chosen it, because I'd fought for it, because my grandfather had believed in me enough to leave me everything he'd built, trusting that I would be worthy of his faith. The farm taught me that family isn't just about who raises you, it's about who sees your potential and gives you the tools to become who you're meant to be. My grandfather had done that from a distance, through a carefully crafted will and a journal full of wisdom. And now, standing on land that stretched toward the horizon, land that was mine to protect and nurture and eventually pass on, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me all along. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I came from farmers and dreamers, from people who believed in something bigger than themselves. And that legacy, that inheritance of love and hope and stubborn determination was worth more than any amount of land or money. It was worth everything. Thank you so much for listening to Samantha's story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories of resilience, family, and unexpected discoveries. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for something that belonged to you? Have you discovered unexpected connections to family you never knew? Share your story with our community and click on one of the stories on your screen now for another journey you won't want to miss.